Let's get started with Chapter 2. Chapter 2 starts our chemistry chapters. We have two of them. Chapter 2 focuses on general properties of atoms, molecules, chemical reactions, and water. Chapter 3 focuses on carbon and biological molecules, so carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and DNA. But before we can get to those molecules, we need to understand some of the basic properties of molecules in general. But why do we start with chemistry? I get that question a lot because this is an intro biology class. But the reason that we start with chemistry is that chemistry is the foundation of biology. You'll see throughout this semester that physics also governs some of the rules of life. Chemistry governs some of the rules of life. And if you remember from our discussion of biological organization, we started with the molecule. The molecule was sort of the smallest level of organization that we talked about. And that's because molecules come together to form organelles or to form cells. And so at the molecule level, we begin to see emergent properties. If you remember, we talked about chlorophyll. That chlorophyll molecule by itself really doesn't do much, but when you organize it with other chlorophyll molecules, with other proteins, with other reactants in the process of photosynthesis, you get a functional process, and that process is photosynthesis, where you can convert light energy into sun energy. So even there, we begin to see a foundation in chemistry. But it's not just chlorophyll. It's also DNA, our biological molecule of inheritance. DNA is a very large, very complex molecule, but it's made up of smaller parts that follow the rules of chemistry. And so that's why we start there. DNA allows the cell to produce proteins. It allows it to process carbohydrates and to process proteins and to process lipids. And then there are a few other molecules that are really important for the cell as well. But they all go back to chemistry. So let's start here with the periodic table. You're probably familiar with this from chemistry or from high school biology or chemistry. And it's just a table that summarizes all of the known elements. And they're organized based on their characteristics. So on the left there we have hydrogen. It's a very reactive molecule. We've got a couple of columns of molecules that form salts. And then in the middle, roughly in the middle, we have metals and metal-like molecules. On the right-hand side, we have some of our more reactive molecules, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, very reactive. Our second column there from the right like to form salts as well. These are charged molecules. And then on the far right we have our noble gases. These are unreactive molecules. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of these molecules in a minute. General trends in this periodic table: as you move right to left and down, you increase the number of protons and neutrons. Those are the particles that make up these elements, or the atoms of these elements. As you go top to bottom, you increase number of electrons. Electrons are really important in chemical reactions. And then the final property that's important for us is electronegativity. So as you move from left to right and bottom to top, you increase electronegativity, which is how strongly an atom will pull another one towards it. We don't focus too much on the periodic table, and the main reason is that we're really worried about four molecules in particular. In biology, we are worried about oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen. And that's because those four elements make up 96% of the body mass of any living organism. Those four elements are considered essential. That means they are required for normal, healthy function of an organism. Those four molecules are also the basis of all of our big four biological molecules that we'll talk about in Chapter 3. Oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen are all the basis for those big molecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and DNA. And then there's a few others that are important as well, but those are the main ones. So we have these essential elements. Roughly a quarter of all elements are essential. Those top four are required in large quantities, but then down on the bottom you see some other elements that are required in much smaller quantities. Those are trace elements. Trace elements are essential but just required in smaller amounts, and they vary based on the organism or the type of organism. So a bacterium might require a specific different element than, say, a human or a lizard. One example of this is iodine. So iodine is required by humans and some other organisms that have thyroids. The thyroid is a gland that secretes hormones, and that primarily influences metabolic rate, so chemical reactions in the body, and protein synthesis. So that's also really important for normal function of an organism. So let's talk a little bit about compounds. Actually, let me go back. I forgot to define elements. So elements are any substance that can't be broken down further by a chemical reaction. So for example, the element of carbon is a group of carbon molecules. There's nothing else mixed in, it's just pure carbon molecules. Compounds, on the other hand, are a mixture of two different elements, or more, can be more than two elements. And here we see more emergent properties. We come back to this idea quite a bit in the beginning unit of our course. And remember, emergent properties are qualities or properties that arise with new levels of organization. So down here we have sodium chloride. You're all familiar with sodium chloride because it's just table salt. It's in all our food. We put it on our food. It comes in our food. Obviously, we can eat it. As long as you eat a moderate amount, it doesn't make you sick. But if you look at the individual elements that make up sodium chloride, we have sodium, which is a solid that you don't want to eat, and we have chlorine gas that's poisonous. So we have these two toxic elements, but when they're combined, we get something that we can consume, something that we can ingest. So when they're combined in the right ratio, when they mix together properly, we get a completely different element. So over there on the right-hand side, we see the arrangement of sodium and chlorine that gives us sodium chloride or table salt. So we'll talk about a lot of different compounds. Just understand that an element is a single group of atoms, a single type of atom, whereas a compound is a mixture of different atoms or elements. So let's talk about these atoms. Sometimes atom and element are used interchangeably, and that's because they are essentially the same thing. An atom is the smallest piece of an element. So if you have a group of carbon molecules, you have an element, but if you have a single carbon, you have an atom. So they're represented by the same symbol, and whether you have one or you have many carbon atoms, so either a single atom or an element of carbon, they retain the same properties of that element. So all carbon molecules are going to behave the same and have the same properties. So let's talk about the structure of the atom. So let's say that we are talking, well, really any atom we want to talk about. Here is just sort of a general diagram of an atom. An atom is made up of three what we call subatomic particles. There is what we call a nucleus. The nucleus of the atom is made up of protons and neutrons. And then around the nucleus, we say that there's a cloud of electrons. So protons and neutrons weigh roughly the same. They make up the majority of the mass of an electron. And so they're the heaviest part of the of the atom. Protons are positively charged. We can see that reflected there in the pink circles in our diagram. Neutrons have no charge. They contribute weight, but they don't contribute charge to the atom. And then our electrons are negatively charged. So electrons sort of move in a cloud around these protons and neutrons, and they stay with the protons because they're negatively charged. The electrons are attracted to that positive charge within that atomic core due to the protons. Atoms are mostly empty space. We have the atomic core, they're made up of protons and neutrons, and then we have electrons buzzing around. And those electrons will fill a lot of space around those atoms. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that atoms are extremely small. You can fit thousands of them in the space of a period on a piece of paper. So they're very, very tiny. And often that's hard for people to imagine. If you think of them using an analogy, if you were to say that a helium atom were the size of a stadium, that atomic nucleus would be the size of a pencil eraser at the center, and electrons would fill the space of the stadium, basically buzzing around in a cloud around that pencil tip, but filling up the entire space of the stadium, moving around within that entire space. Electrons themselves would be the size of gnats, so they would be extremely tiny, but atoms are incredibly small. They're nowhere near the size of a stadium. And as I said, you can fill millions of them within the space of a period. So let's talk about some of the information that we can get from the periodic table that characterizes these elements, these atoms that we're looking at. So over on the left, we see a box. This box is supposed to represent a box from the periodic table. And then on the right is sort of a shorthand notation. If you were to write this information on a piece of paper, the way that you would write out the same information. So we see helium there. Helium has an atomic number of 2. The atomic number is equal to the number of protons. So the number of protons is really what defines an atom. If you change the number of protons, you get an entirely different atom. This is in contrast to neutrons and electrons that can change depending on the molecule. In the center of that box, we have the letters He. This is the element symbol for helium. So each of our atoms has a specific symbol. I don't require you to memorize any of them, really, except for hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen. Those are just the first letters of the words. And there are a few that you might memorize just because we use them a few times, but you don't have to memorize really anything from the periodic table. Underneath that, we have the atomic mass. So the atomic mass is based on the number of protons and the number of neutrons. So you add them together and you end up essentially with a weight, also called a mass number. Mass number and atomic mass are slightly different. For the purposes of this class, we're going to call them the same. Don't tell a chemistry instructor that I said that because they are slightly different. But the difference comes from the number of electrons. One accounts for the very, very tiny number of electrons and an estimate of the units that you use to measure these guys. But we're going to just call the atomic mass and the mass number the same thing. I tend to use the phrase atomic mass because that's the information we get from the periodic table. So you can determine the number of protons or the number of neutrons from the periodic table. So over there on the right-hand side, we have our shorthand shorthand notation for sodium. Sodium is represented by Na. And here we see that we have the atomic number on the bottom. So the atomic number for sodium is 11. This means it has 11 protons. Based on an approximate atomic mass on the top, we can determine that there are 12 neutrons. So remember, the atomic mass, or the atomic number, is just the weight of the protons plus the neutrons. So we have 11 protons, which means we have 12 neutrons for a total mass of 23. Let's talk about the number of electrons. So if you have a charge neutral atom, you have a number of electrons equal to the number of protons. So over there in helium, when it doesn't have any charge, and it really doesn't ever have any charge, if we have 2 protons, we have 2 electrons. Because remember, each of those have a charge. Protons have a positive charge, electrons have a negative charge. And so similarly, sodium should have 11 protons if it's sodium, therefore it should have 11 electrons if it is charge neutral. Sometimes a lot of these atoms will actually lose an electron, and so they'll carry a charge with them. But if they're neutral, if they've not lost or gained any electrons, the number of electrons is equal to the number of protons. So electrons are really important, and they are the subatomic particle that we are most interested in. The reason that they're so important is that they are the part of the atom that's involved in a chemical reaction. And the reason is that electrons have a charge, and electrons contain energy. So they're busy moving around in a cloud around these protons, and they're attracted to their own proton because of their negative charge, because the protons are positively charged. But if you've taken any sort of physics or just general science, you know that if something has energy, it can do something with that energy. It can do work. So electrons have potential energy. This means that they have energy that can be used for something. And that's part of the reason that they're so important in chemical reactions. Electrons are often shared by molecules or passed from one molecule to another. And when they are transferred, energy is transferred as well. So you can get an electron moving from one atom to another, or being attracted from one atom or another. And when that happens, you get energy movement with it. Some sort of key information about electron behavior. Electrons sort of behave like a ball bouncing down a flight of stairs. They reside at very specific energy levels. So if you think about a ball bouncing down the stairs, it cannot stay in between steps. It can either be on one step or the next step down or the next step after that, but it can't sort of hover in between. It can come to a stop on one or the next, but not in the middle. And it's the same for our electrons. Electrons reside in what we call shells, and they have to be in one shell or another. So they can move in between shells. They can have a specific amount of energy and be in a specific shell, or they can gain energy and move out into an outer shell, or lose energy and move to an inner shell, but they can't hang out in between. And this is really important for our chemical reactions. Electrons that are further from the nucleus have higher potential energy. They contain more energy and are therefore more likely to react. So here we have a diagram of these so-called electron shells. And if you look at hydrogen there, we have one electron shell and we have one electron. As we move right to left and top to bottom, we increase the number of electrons. So if we move over to helium there, that was the example that we used with our atomic number, symbol, and mass. We see that we have gained an electron. We've also gained a proton because we've moved from atomic number 1 to atomic number 2. And we've also gained an electron. So now we have 2 electrons in helium. So in that very first shell, in both hydrogen and helium, we have only one shell. In that very first shell of helium, we have 2 electrons. One key thing about electrons is that they like to reside in pairs, and so when they are residing in pairs, any paired up electron is not really going to be involved in anything. It's happy where it is. If you look at the next row, we have a second shell. So starting there with lithium, we now have 3 electrons. We also have 3 protons. And you can see that that first shell has only 2 electrons. That's one characteristic of that first shell. It only ever has up to 2 electrons. So it can have 1 electron or it can have 2. They fill up in pairs. So once you have 2 electrons in that shell, electrons have to reside in the next shell. So if you look left to right, we've got lithium, beryllium, boron. Each one is adding an electron. They are added 1, 2, 3, 4, and then they start to pair up. So carbon has 4, nitrogen now has 5, and you can see that they've drawn them in pairs because remember, they like to be in pairs. But they don't pair up until there's 4 in a shell. All the way over to neon, we have all of our electrons filling that second shell. So now we have 10 electrons, 2 in the first shell and 8 in the second shell. Continuing with this trend, when we move down to the third shell, we start adding our electrons one at a time. So sodium has now 1 in that outer shell, move left to right all the way up to argon, who has its entire outer shell filled up. They are all found in pairs. So continuing on with our discussion of these electron shells, the shell that we are most worried about when it comes to chemical reactions is the valence shell. So the valence shell is the outermost shell, and it depends on the atom, whether it is the first, second, or third shell. Our example there is nitrogen. It has 2 shells. And the reason that we're worried about the valence shell is because valence electrons are the ones that are going to be involved in a chemical reaction. Those are the electrons that are going to be shared or passed to another molecule to interact with them. So they are the electrons that are forming chemical bonds. So the valence shell is the outermost shell. The valence electrons are the electrons that are found in that shell. And the bonding capacity is the number of unpaired electrons that are found in the valence shell. So it can be different. The bonding capacity can be different than the number of valence electrons. If we look there, nitrogen has 5 valence electrons. It has 7 electrons total, but those electrons in the inner shell are not reactive. In that valence shell, we have 5, so we have 2 that are paired up on top. So those electrons are not going to react with anybody. They want to stay paired. And then we have those 3 unpaired electrons, and those are the ones that want to pair up. They want to have an electron buddy that is in another atom they're going to be attracted to and sort of stay with to form a chemical bond. So it's those unpaired valence electrons that are really important for chemical reactions. So nitrogen has a bonding capacity of 3. This means that nitrogen is going to bond with up to 3 other atoms. Quite often we have nitrogen bonding to hydrogen and oxygen, and we will look at some of the molecules that are nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen rich in a few minutes. For now, I'm going to end this video. We'll come back to bonding capacity a little bit later when we talk about some specific atoms.